At 8:15 p.m. on Friday, June 17, 1893, a cold gun muzzle pressed against the back of an old man's neck inside the Dustwater Crossing Inn. An old saying, "No ink can ever balance the price of blood," flashed through the man's mind, a warning as sharp as the iron at his spine. Wind from the sagebrush desert, 3 miles west, whipped red dust off the wooden sign outside. Dustwater Crossing, 10 miles to Rail Depot, making the oil lamp in the corner of the Flickering Light Saloon tremble. The room held 13 people. 5 miners whose faces were as lined as the seams they dug, 3 women with hands stained by laundry and cooking, 4 horse traders smelling of leather and sweat, and a girl no more than 8, peeling potatoes with serious concentration. Every eye was now on the table by the window. A man with silver hair and broad shoulders sat there. He moved slowly, but not from weakness. His motions had the precision of someone who had once measured time by heartbeats. He turned a small knife in his calloused fingers, whittling a bar of soap into a tiny, smooth figurine, a habit he performed whenever he waited. The man's name was Alden Burke. Around his left wrist hung a chipped porcelain bishop from a chess set, threaded through a weathered leather cord. No one in Dustwater knew its story. It was the only trophy Alden still carried from a night decades earlier when cards were played for more than money. The door banged open and 3 strangers entered. Mud caked their boots, and the low ceiling forced them to remove their hats. A sour smell of stale sweat and trail dust rode in with them. The leader wore a black leather coat embroidered with an hourglass in brown thread, a symbol no one in Dustwater had seen before. He did not speak a greeting. He walked straight to Alden's table and pressed a revolver's muzzle into the old man's neck, whispering, "Don't turn." Alden's reaction was to carve one more sliver from the soap. The innkeeper, cloth in hand, froze mid-wipe. The cigar smoke a horse trader had just exhaled hung like a ribbon in the dim light. The little girl gasped and clutched her potato, eyes wide at the sight of the hourglass emblem. "Are you Burke?" the gunman asked, his voice flat and judicial. "They say you once ferried 12 souls through Rat's Pass with nothing but a rope and a knife." Alden did not blink. The onlookers assumed he was just a kindly old whittler. They did not know those hands had cut a family free from a noose during a flash flood 8 years prior. They did not know the porcelain bishop had once been jammed into the vent hole of a powder magazine to stop a spark and save a town. They thought, but they did not know. The second stranger set a small cloth bag on the table. He loosened the string and spilled a piece of porcelain onto the wood. It was another bishop, pristine and black, its glaze catching the lamplight. On its base were scratched 2 letters, PM. Alden felt his blood chill. That black bishop belonged to a set he had thought lost with his father when a supply wagon was ambushed 15 years earlier. Silence stretched so taut that the tick of the inn's pendulum clock sounded like hammer strikes. Oil light glinted off the black glaze, making it seem like an eye staring back at Alden. He lowered his knife, staring at the piece, knowing its appearance was not coincidence. Someone had dug into his past and was now arranging a new game. Everyone in the room wondered the same unspoken question. Why had the black bishop come to Dustwater tonight, and who was setting this new board? Dustwater Crossing was a crossroads town of 3 dusty streets. On maps, it rated as a dot between the Charcoal Mesa and the Snake River, a place where the stagecoach changed horses, miners sold ore for supplies, and railroad agents bought land for rails. The Flickering Light sat at the corner of Main and Water Street, across from a blacksmith's lean-to and a feed store with a faded sign. Out back, wagons creaked, mules stomped, and beer barrels rolled. Dustwater was the kind of place where people knew how many nails were in their neighbor's barn, but not how many secrets the man carried. The hourglass stitched into the stranger's coats unsettled folks because it was new. New meant trouble. Alden Burke had lived in Dustwater for 9 years. He slept in a room above the cooper's shop, traded whittled figurines for meals, and fixed wagon wheels when he felt like working. Most days he kept his head down and his hands busy. He fed stray cats in the alley. He walked the same route from the inn to the well at dawn and dusk. On Sundays he sat outside the little church, listening without going in. People assumed he had always been part of the town, like the water tower or the cottonwood that shaded the hitching rail. They said he spoke in measured sentences and never raised his voice. They never asked about the leather cord around his wrist. They did not want his stories. Stories cost attention, and attention could invite trouble. 20 years ago, before he was Alden the carpenter and whittler, he had been the bishop, a scout and smuggler known for navigating Rat's Pass. Rat's Pass was not a trail. It was a crack in Dead Man's Ridge, barely wider than a wagon tongue that wound for 3 miles between limestone walls. Flash floods and rockfalls made it lethal. Bandits ambushed from the ledges. To cross it you needed a rope, a knife, and an exact memory of every nook. Alden had those things. He also had a debt, a life he had failed to save, and a game he had lost. That game had cost his father's life. Alden quit the pass, threw his gear into a trunk, and swore never to guide again. "They think you're done," whispered Mara Lynn, the innkeeper's daughter, a woman in her 40s whose eyes missed nothing. She stood behind the bar, her hands moving on instinct while her mind raced. "But you carved the bishop for a reason," she added, looking at the porcelain on his wrist. Alden met her gaze briefly. He knew what she meant. He kept the chipped bishop not as a talisman, but as a reminder. Some debts cannot be run from. They can only be faced on your own terms. The strangers did not know that. They saw an old man and saw leverage. Alden studied the black bishop on the table. "Who sent you?" he asked quietly. The leader's smile didn't reach his eyes. "A man who collected more than tithe and less than mercy. He wants you to lead us through Raven's Mouth tomorrow night." Alden's thumb traced the chipped edge of his own bishop. Raven's Mouth was a canyon north of Rat's Pass, narrower, with ledges where only ghosts walked. He had never taken anyone through there. "I'm finished guiding," he said. "Not after tonight," the gunman replied. He lifted the gun fractionally, as if to remind Alden of its weight. "Our preacher wants what he's owed. You owe him a path." The men in the room thought Alden would fold under threat. They were wrong. He weighed the hourglass emblem, the initials PM on the black bishop, and the request for Raven's Mouth. Only one man connected those things. Preacher Morrow, a charlatan who years ago blessed wagon trains and then stole them in the night. Morrow had disappeared after a posse burned his church, taking the bishop set that Alden had wagered and lost. The black bishop on the table meant Morrow was alive. More importantly, it meant Morrow had been watching Alden long enough to know where to send his men. Burke's jaw tightened. He would have to walk back into a pass with killers behind him and possibly Morrow ahead. He slid the carved soap piece into his pocket and nodded once. "I'll take you," he said, voice even, "but only on my terms." The leader's eyes narrowed, but he gestured for his men to lower their weapons. Mara exhaled softly, and outside, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of storm sand. Dustwater Crossing held its breath. Tomorrow, someone's debt would be called. Alden stepped out into the street with the 3 strangers flanking him. The clock on the church steeple across the square read 8:30 p.m. Lamps along Main Street flickered as the desert wind found its way between planks. He could feel the eyes of townsfolk following from behind curtains. He led the men to his room above the cooper's shop. The cooper, Jasper Gray, sat on his porch whittling a dowel. When he saw the hourglass emblem, his hands froze. Alden nodded as if everything were normal and climbed the ladder to his loft. Inside, the air smelled of pitch and wood shavings. Against one wall sat a chest bound with iron straps and scarred by years. Alden had nailed it shut when he buried the bishop. He pried the lid open with the tip of his knife. Inside lay the instruments of a life he had sworn off. 100 feet of hemp rope coiled tight, a bone-handled knife with a notch for each year on the trail, and a leather map case. Underneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, was a folded ledger page with faded ink and a chess bishop sketched in the corner. It listed names and debts and 2 letters at the top. P.M. Alden had kept it as a reminder of his loss. He pulled the rope and knife free. The strangers exchanged glances. "Why the knife?" one asked. "Because rock cuts rope," Alden replied, "and because some knots aren't tied to be undone." He slung the rope over his shoulder, tucked the knife into his belt, and strapped on his old satchel. Mara Lynn appeared at the trap door. "Here," she said, handing Alden a brown paper bundle. Inside was half a loaf of bread, dried venison, and a small clay bottle of water. "You saved my boy when Rat's Pass flooded," she whispered. "You don't owe anyone anything, Alden." He shook his head. "We're all on somebody's ledger, Mara. It's just a question of who writes the names." He touched the leather cord on his wrist. "And when?" Mara squeezed his arm. "Then make sure you write this entry." Back in the street, Alden turned to the strangers. "We travel at midnight," he said. 3 horses. You carry what you can on your backs. Leave the rest." The leader started to protest, but Alden cut him off. "Raven's Mouth isn't a trail, it's a test. The less weight, the better your chance to pass." He looked at their boots. "Those soles won't grip limestone. Wrap them in leather. If you slip, the canyon doesn't forgive." The men muttered but agreed. Alden added one final condition. "When we reach the split, no one runs ahead. No one raises a gun without my word. Break that, and the canyon takes you." He spent the next few hours preparing. He visited Old Man Hatcher, the blacksmith, and bought 3 iron pitons. Hatcher raised an eyebrow. "Climbing again?" he asked. Alden gave a half-smile. "Guiding, for ghosts." He returned to his loft and unrolled the map case. Inside were 2 parchments, one of Rat's Pass and one of Raven's Mouth. He traced the lines with his finger, memorizing where the rock jutted and where water pooled. His memory filled in what the map could not. A narrow ledge at marker 5 that looked solid but crumbled under weight. A crevice near step 9 that held a snake pit in summer. A carving he had made of a bishop on the canyon wall at marker 12. A sign to his younger self that he had gone halfway. He would need to carve another sign tonight. At 11:45 p.m., the sky was ink, a sliver of moon just enough to silhouette the Snake River to the east. The strangers returned, boots wrapped in strips of hide, faces set. Each carried a saddlebag with supplies and a rifle. Alden's own rifle remained under his bed. He had decided not to carry it. A knife and rope would have to be enough. The leader introduced himself as Bishop, a cruel play on the porcelain piece, and his companions as Riley and Cade. Alden said nothing. He extinguished his lantern, adjusted his rope and knife, and headed toward the dark shape of Dead Man's Ridge. Behind him, the church bell rang 12 times. Dustwater's echo died with the 12th chime. The crossing had begun. The trail to Raven's Mouth led north out of Dustwater, past the abandoned silver pits, and then up a steep goat path lined with scrub. The night smelled of creosote and cool stone. Coyotes sang somewhere to the east. Alden walked in front, rope coiled across his chest, his boots silent on the dusty ground. Bishop, Riley, and Cade followed, their eyes darting to every shadow. The glow of Dustwater faded behind them, replaced by the immense dark of Dead Man's Ridge. After an hour, the ridge loomed, a wall of limestone dappled with juniper and sage. A narrow cleft opened like a mouth into its face. Raven's mouth. At the entrance, Alden stopped. He untied his rope and looped it around a boulder, securing it with a clove hitch. He handed the other end to Bishop. "Hold when I tell you," he said. Then he tested the first 5 feet of the canyon floor with the tip of his boot. Dust slid into darkness. The floor dropped into a shallow pit where floodwater had scoured a channel. Alden lay on his belly, eased himself in, and balanced on his forearms until his feet found a ledge 2 feet below. "Now," he whispered. Bishop kept the rope taut while Alden traversed to the far side. Once across, Alden wedged a piton into a crack and tied the rope off. "Your turn." The men moved cautiously, gripping the rope, sliding feet along the rim of the pit. Riley slipped once. Alden's rope caught him. Beyond the pit, the canyon narrowed to just wider than a man's shoulders. The walls were smooth from seasonal floods. Moonlight barely reached the floor. At marker 3, the path turned right, then right again, forming a blind corner. Alden paused. "Stay close," he murmured. He could feel the air funneling, hear faint wind whistling, a sound like someone blowing over a bottle. That sound had saved him before. It meant a side crack where the canyon breathed. He reached out, found the crack at waist height, and traced it until it widened enough for fingers. He squeezed sideways through, chest scraping stone, and emerged onto a ledge 8 feet above the main path. From there he could see down to the canyon floor where the path continued. He signaled. The men followed, grunting as they squeezed through. "Why up here?" Cade whispered. Alden pointed to the floor below. In the darkness, shapes moved. 2 men stood at the main trail, rifles resting on hips, hourglass symbols glinting on their coats. Shadows behind them hinted at more bodies. "Because we're not alone," Alden breathed. Bishop swore under his breath. "Morrow's men?" Alden's jaw tightened. He had suspected the preacher wouldn't trust the trio. Now he had proof. "We're walking into a trap," he said. "Your preacher doesn't intend to pay any debt. He intends to tie off the old ones." He slid along the ledge toward marker 7, a notch in the rock where he had once carved a bishop. The carving was still there, weathered but visible. He pressed his palm against it and thought of his father. He whispered instructions. "We're taking the high route. Step where I step. Don't dislodge stones. And if I tell you to run, you run toward the river. Trust the water over the bullets." They moved, hugging the wall, bodies pressed against limestone. At marker 8, Alden lowered himself down to the canyon floor, landing noiselessly behind a boulder. The 2 hourglass men were 10 yards away, whispering about whether to build a fire. Alden gestured to Cade. The younger man picked up a pebble and tossed it against the opposite wall. It clacked, echoing deeper in the canyon. The men turned, rifles raised. Alden stood, knife in hand, and stepped behind them. He didn't stab. He put a hand over each mouth and whispered, "Quiet," as he struck the butt of his knife against their temples. They crumpled. Bishop stared, eyes wide. "You're not rusty," he murmured. Alden didn't answer. They dragged the bodies into the crack and continued. The canyon grew steeper. At marker 10, a pool filled the path. Moonlight silvered its surface. Alden dipped a fingertip. "Cold. It's deep," he said. He tied the rope around his waist and swam across, kicking silently, knife clenched in his teeth. The men followed, gasping as the water numbed them. When they reached the far side, voices echoed ahead. Alden motioned them to crouch behind a fallen log. From around the bend came the low murmur of at least 6 men and the occasional metallic clink of guns. A single deeper voice intoned something like a sermon. Morrow. Alden looked at his companions. This is the split. Beyond this, there's no turning back. Bishop's lips thinned. We came for this. Riley looked scared, but nodded. Cade gripped his rifle. Alden took a breath. In that breath, he heard the whistle his father had used to signal safe passage, and the whistle Morrow had used the night the wagon was ambushed. They were different. He would have to make sure the preacher heard the correct one. The bend opened into a wider chamber where Raven's mouth seemed to pause before narrowing again. Lanterns burned along the walls, casting fat shadows. In the center stood Preacher Phineas Morrow. He wore a long black coat over a crisp white shirt, a silver cross hanging at his chest, and like the men around him, an hourglass embroidered at his shoulder. His hair, once blonde, was now snow white, but his eyes remained sharp and predatory. On a rock near his boot sat a wooden chest, its lid stamped with a bishop crest. Around him lounged 5 armed men. 2 more stood on ledges, rifles covering the chamber. The pool behind them reflected the lantern light like a second inverted world. Morrow's voice echoed in the stone. "Brother Burke," he said, as if greeting a parishioner. "You've kept me waiting." Alden stepped into the light, rope draped over one shoulder, knife visible at his belt. He kept his posture relaxed, not raising his hands. He let his gaze flick around the cavern, noting positions. Riley and Cade followed 2 steps behind him, Bishop lingering in the shadows. "You always did like an audience," Alden replied. "And you always preferred a narrow path," Morrow said, spreading his hands as if blessing him. His smile tightened. "I missed our games." "Chess is lonely with no one to take the other side." He tapped the lid of the chest beside him. "Do you remember this?" Alden did. It was the bishop set he had lost, the set his father had carved from bone and inlaid with turquoise. The black bishop piece on the table in Dustwater had come from this chest. "Why drag me here?" Alden asked, keeping his voice steady. "Why not send a bullet and be done?" Morrow chuckled. "Because bullet stories are over in a sentence. Debt stories, those linger. You owed me a debt when you walked away with my bishop. You owed me a debt when you took 12 souls through Rat's Pass that were meant for me. You owed me when you failed to save your father." Alden's jaw clenched, but he kept his breathing even. "What do you want?" he said. Morrow gestured to the chest. "A trade." "The names in this ledger," he patted his pocket, "for your continued relevance. You guide my men and my goods through Raven's mouth for the next 3 months. You become my bishop again. In return, I give you the names of everyone who conspired against your father." He lifted the ledger just enough for Alden to see the edge of yellowed paper. "And I forgive your debt." Alden knew a trap when he heard one. Morrow's ledger was leverage. Once he had Alden guiding again, he could throw him away. And there was the matter of the men with rifles trained on them. He looked at Bishop. The man's jaw moved slightly, a small shake. He wasn't playing of his own free will. He was under Morrow's thumb. Riley's knuckles were white. Cade's eyes flicked between Morrow and Alden. Alden took a slow breath. He would have to use the canyon itself as a weapon, the way he once used rope and water. He reached to his wrist and slid the chipped bishop free from its leather cord. The porcelain was warm from his skin. He held it up. "This piece belonged to my father," he said loudly enough for the chamber to carry the words. "It was the last thing he touched before he died. You play games with pieces, Phineas. I don't. Before Morrow could reply, Alden hurled the chipped bishop toward the pool. It arced, white against the dark, and splashed. Morrow's eyes widened. His men's heads turned instinctively. That was the moment Alden needed. He snapped his hand down and whistled 2 notes, the whistle from Rat's Pass, not the preacher's. Riley and Cade dropped flat. Bishop, hidden at the side, kicked a loose rock onto the ledge where one rifleman stood. The man stumbled, his shot going high. Alden dove left, rolled behind a stalagmite, and drew his knife. Morrow shouted, "Shoot him!" Gunfire exploded, loud in the confined space. Bullets sparked off limestone. Alden crawled low, using the uneven floor as cover, feeling each heartbeat as if it were a second ticking off the rest of his life. He reached the base of the ledge under another rifleman. The man leaned out, aiming at Bishop. Alden jammed his knife into a crack and hauled himself up by the rope, scrambling onto the ledge behind the man. He grabbed the shooter's collar and yanked backward. The man toppled, crashing down onto his comrades. Bishop fired a rifle he had wrestled from one of Morrow's men, dropping another. Riley had a small revolver and fired blindly but bravely. Cade, crouched by the stalagmite, threw stones to create distractions. Morrow ducked behind the chest, cursing, his silver cross swinging. Gunfire echoed, interlaced with the preacher's shouted orders and the grunt of men falling. Alden slid down, landing hard. He wrenched a rifle from one of the fallen hourglass men and fired a single shot, not at a person but at the support of the lantern above Morrow. The chain snapped, the lantern crashed, oil spreading flame across the chest and the ledger. Morrow screamed and lunged to snatch the book from the fire. The chest lid swung open, spilling chess pieces across the floor. White knights rolled with black pawns, bishops with rooks, bone and wood mingling. It looked like a grave dug for games. The fire sent thick smoke upward. Men coughed, eyes watering. Alden seized the moment. "Now!" he shouted. He and his companions sprinted for the narrow exit on the far side. Morrow roared, "After them!" But his men were choking, and the path was a bottleneck. As Alden reached the gap, he slammed his shoulder into a limestone column that he knew from years of mapping. The column cracked, then tipped, blocking the passage as it fell. Dust and smoke filled the cavern, Morrow's curses muffled behind a wall of stone. Outside the chamber, the canyon was a cold wind. Alden and the 3 men staggered through, gasping for clean air. Their clothes were singed, their hands scraped, but they were alive. Behind them, the blocked passage would hold until the next flood. They could hear the preacher's shouts fading as they retreated deeper into the maze. Alden clenched his jaw. He had not killed Morrow. Not yet. But he had taken his board, his pieces, and his ledger. It was time to see whether the town would take back the game. They emerged from the canyon at dawn, shadows long across the scrub plain. The Snake River shimmered in pale light. Birds sang in the cottonwoods along its bank. Alden, Bishop, Riley, and Cade trudged toward Dustwater, smoke from the Flickering Light's chimney marking the town. Their boots left 4 parallel lines in the powdery sand. Alden carried Morrow's scorched ledger tucked inside his satchel. He felt its weight like a promise. Dustwater woke with the sun. Children ran to the well with buckets. Women swept front steps. Miners headed toward the assay office. When Alden appeared, covered in soot and dust, rope slung over his shoulder, the townsfolk paused. Mara Lynn stood in the inn doorway, flour on her apron. "You look like you've been through a chimney," she said, masking her relief. Alden nodded toward his companions. "We all did." Bishop removed his hat. "Where's the church bell?" he asked quietly. "It needs ringing," Alden replied. They walked to the empty patch of ground that Dustwater called its square. In the center stood a low platform used for auctions and announcements. Alden climbed it. Miners, traders, mothers with babies on hips, and the barber with his razor still in hand gathered. Old Man Hatcher wiped soot on his apron and came forward. Alden held up the blackened ledger. "Phineas Morrow still lives," he said, his voice carrying. A murmur ran through the crowd. "He owes us more than tolls. He owes us truth." He opened the ledger. Inside were columns of names, dates, and numbers. The top of each page bore the hourglass symbol and the letters PM. The entries dated back 16 years. They listed amounts of grain taken, cattle extorted, acres of land signed over under threat, and names of those who resisted and died. Among the names were 3 that drew gasps: Jonas Lynn, Mara's brother, Amy Hatcher, the blacksmith's wife, James Burke, Alden's father. Mara pushed forward, her face pale. "My brother drowned in Rat's Pass," she whispered. "Morrow said the flood took him." Alden pointed to the ledger. "It was no flood. It was an hourglass tax. Morrow took the pass because he needed a chasm to hide men like Jonas." Old Man Hatcher's eyes watered. "They said Amy fell from the ridge," he rasped. "Morrow had her pushed because she wouldn't pay for a train she never rode." Voices rose. Anger, disbelief, realization. Bishop stepped up beside Alden and spoke for the first time to the town. "I was raised by Morrow's gang," he confessed. "I carried his symbol because he told me I owed him. But I owed these." He gestured to the names. "We all do." Alden held up his hands. The porcelain bishop no longer dangled from his wrist. It lay somewhere in Raven's mouth. "Some debts are paid with blood, others with coin," he said. "But this ledger shows debts we didn't even know we owed. If we stay quiet, we pay forever. If we speak, we may have to fight, but at least the terms will be ours." The crowd was silent for a heartbeat. Then Mara stepped onto the platform, tore a page from the ledger, and held it up. "This line is my brother's," she said. "I won't pay it. Will you?" The barber shook his head. A miner with missing fingers raised his pick and slammed it into the ground as if breaking a chain. The blacksmith lifted his hammer. One by one, voices joined. "No, no more. He owes us." The marshal, Dustwater's lawman, a thin man named Harvey Pace, pushed his way through, badge glinting. For years he had let the hourglass men pass through. He looked at Alden, then at the ledger. "I swore to keep order," he said, his voice shaking. "Maybe I took that to mean obedience. Maybe it's time it means justice." He unclipped his holster, handing his gun to Alden. "What do we do?" Alden took the revolver but did not point it. "We send a message," he said. "We nail this ledger to the church door, we ring the bell, and we stand on the road with our own hourglasses turned over. If Morrow comes, he finds a town awake. If his men come, they find names waiting for them." He looked around. "No one rides alone. We ride in pairs. We watch the ridge. We learn to whistle back." Mara and Bishop nailed the ledger page to the church door. The bell rope creaked as Old Man Hatcher pulled, and the bell sounded deep and clear across the desert. The sound carried to the far ridges and, with luck, into the preacher's ears. In the saloon, the hourglass embroidered on the strangers' coats was cut off and tossed into the stove. Dustwater, which had survived by looking away, now had to learn to look straight at its fear and see it for what it was, a debt collector hiding behind scripture. The town busied itself, stacking sandbags at the pass road, sharpening tools, teaching children to load water buckets. Courage looked like routine. It looked like a barber shaving men who now stood with rifles outside his door. News travels faster than horses. By the time the sun was overhead, Riders had already seen the ledger nailed to Dustwater's church. Fires were seen in the west at midday, signal fires along the Hourglass Gang's routes. Alden knew Morrow would not ignore the bell. He also knew the canyon would not hold him forever. There were other ways through, and men hungrier than Morrow would smell weakness. Dustwater needed to make it stand on its own terms. That evening, Alden, Bishop, and Mara rode out with 7 volunteers, the blacksmith, the barber, 2 miners, the feed store owner, and a pair of brothers who drove freight wagons. Their plan was not to ambush, just to watch. They took positions on the ridges overlooking Rat's Pass and Raven's Mouth. As twilight deepened, dust plumes rose on the western horizon. Through spyglasses, Alden counted 11 riders with hourglass marks. At their center rode a figure in a white coat, Morrow. He had changed from his preacher's black. Now he wore white like a funeral shroud. At his side rode a man with a long rifle, Quill, Dustwater's most accurate shooter until he vanished 2 years prior. Alden's jaw tightened. He had hoped Quill was dead. Betrayal hurt more when it had a familiar face. He signaled to Mara. She nodded. They had set a plan. Cut them off at the mouth, force a parley, show the ledger. But there was another plan layered beneath. Alden had told the volunteers only part of it. The rest he kept folded like a note in his pocket. The riders reached the base of the ridge as the last light drained. Morrow's men fanned out. Quill raised his rifle at random rocks, firing once to test echoes. "Burke!" Morrow's voice rolled up the canyon, hollow and mocking. "Will you hide behind paper? Come down. Let's settle accounts like men." Alden stood on the ledge where the bishop carving lay. He stepped into view, hands empty. "I'm here," he called back. "But we settle on Dustwater's terms." He lifted the ledger above his head. "We know your debts. We know your murders. Your time has run." Laughter echoed. "My time is the Lord's time," Morrow said. "And he says I collect." He gestured. Men spurred their horses toward the mouth of the pass. Alden whistled 3 notes, a signal he hadn't used since the war. On the ridge to his right, the blacksmith released a rope he had tied around a boulder. The stone rolled, dragging a net of smaller rocks across the slope. The landslide was not lethal, but it churned up dust and startled horses. Riders pulled back, coughing and cursing. Quill fired upward. Bullets whining off rock. Mara stepped forward, rifle raised, and shouted, "Names!" Bishop began to read from the ledger, his voice loud and even. "Jonas Lynn, drowned under orders. Amy Hatcher, pushed for refusing tithe. James Burke, burned for a bishop." Each name hit like a bell toll. The hourglass riders shifted uneasily. Morrow spat. "Shut up!" he bellowed. "Those names bought this town roads and rail and protection." "Protection from whom?" the barber yelled back. "From you?" The argument escalated. Shots cracked. The volunteers fired over the riders' heads, forcing them to duck. A bullet grazed Bishop's arm. He winced but kept reading. Quill took aim at Alden, but Mara saw the glint of his rifle and fired. Her shot hit Quill's hat, knocking it off and marking him. "You never did like missing," Alden shouted to his old friend. Quill hesitated, recognition flaring. His barrel dropped a fraction. "You could have come with us," he called. "And be a collector?" Alden shot back. "I'd rather carve soap." Morrow realized the ridge positions gave Dustwater the advantage. He snarled and raised his hand. "Enough!" he screamed. "If you will not pay, then you will burn." He wheeled his horse, signaling a retreat. His men wheeled with him. Alden's shoulders eased, but he did not move. He knew Morrow's mind. The preacher would regroup, find another way, perhaps through the south where the ridge eased. Alden turned to the volunteers. "This was a warning," he said. The hourglass breaks when we turn it on its side, but only if we keep our fists on it. Keep watching the road, watch each other. This doesn't end tonight. Back in Dustwater, the bell rang again. Children asked why the grown-ups looked tired but relieved. Mara bandaged Bishop's arm and hugged him. The barber sharpened his razor because even in a town at war, beards grew. Alden sat on the steps of the church and looked at the ledger page nailed to the door. The paper fluttered in the evening breeze. He imagined his father's hand writing his name, then Morrow writing a number next to it. He had taken back one debt. Others remained. He rubbed the scar on his wrist where the leather cord had been. In the morning, he would ride south to warn the ranchers. The town now knew what it owed to itself. That was a start. Days turned into weeks. Dustwater's people took turns at night watch, eyes scanning the ridges for glints of rifles. The blacksmith melted down the hourglass emblems they had cut from coats and recast them into horseshoes, turning threat into labor. Mara organized a ledger of her own, not of debts, but of contributions, who carried water, who stood watch, who taught children to shoot if needed. Bishop taught young men to read trails and taught older men to listen for the whistle codes that Alden revived. Riley and Cade decided not to leave. Dustwater had given them their first taste of belonging. Preacher Morrow did not ride back. Rumors said he had retreated to the mountains to gather new followers. Others said he had been killed by those he tried to tax. No one in Dustwater counted him gone. One evening, as the sun bled red across Dead Man's Ridge, Alden climbed the hill behind the church. He carried the charred ledger page with his father's name on it, now brittle. He dug a small hole beneath the cottonwood and laid the page inside. "Pa," he whispered, his voice thick. "I can't change what I did not know. I can't bring you back. I can only make sure no one else loses their father to a game played in secret." He covered the paper with soil and pressed it down. The earth was warm from the day. He sat back and listened to the bell ringing for supper. The smell of stew drifted on the breeze. Children laughed. Dustwater had not been reduced to silence and fear. It buzzed with life, even under threat. Mara joined him, wiping flour from her hands. "Do you miss the Bishop piece?" she asked. Alden looked at his wrist. "It did its job," he said. "It reminded me that some debts can't be paid with money or blood. They can only be paid with truth told out loud." He picked up a twig and began to whittle automatically, the motion as natural as breathing. The twig transformed into a tiny bishop. Mara smiled. "You'll make more pieces," she said. Alden shrugged. "Maybe. Maybe I'm done playing." He tossed the carved twig into his palm and turned it over. Its base was blank. "We still owe ourselves a question," he said quietly. "Not to Morrow, not to the hourglass, to ourselves." "What question?" Mara asked. Alden looked out across Dustwater at the watchfires along the ridge, the silhouettes of friends moving between them, the ledger nailed to the church door. "When the past comes calling with its debt," he said, "will we pay it silently and alone, or will we stand in the open and make it put its name down?" His eyes met hers. "We answered once. We'll have to answer again." He placed the twig bishop on a rock and stood. Night was coming, and the town would need watchers. Alden picked up his rope and knife and headed toward Main Street. The next game, he knew, was always being set by someone somewhere. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about refusing to play by someone else's board. When the past comes calling with its debt, will we pay it silently and alone, or will we stand in the open and demand that it write down its name?